Bien, bonjour à toutes et à tous, ravi de vous accueillir pour cette séquence Comment maîtriser le risque d'escalade. Je suis ravie d'être avec vous sur cette session. Mélanie Bénard-Croza, je suis la rédactrice en chef de Sécurité et Défense Magazine. On va avoir cet échange avec nos invités, 4 invités, et en anglais. Système de traduction qui sont à votre disposition. Les échanges dans les deux langues.
Ask for your headsets at the entrance of the room.
So if you need a translation, you have devices at the beginning, at the entrance of the room. Alors on va revenir sur un certain nombre de points aujourd'hui sur du risque d'escalade, également de la situation géopolitique et des tensions qui s'intensifient. Nous allons
strains and tensions on the geopolitical scale, so the system doesn't need to mitigate this risk, but also to prepare if the situation worsens. And you know, of course, the cyberspace is very important in the new hybrid conflicts. States and NATO, amongst other, and our guest today, Ben, will discuss also the case of NATO, has the possibility to respond to cyber attacks. So what is the state of play? We'll take stock of the situation and we'll try to avoid the theories of the media and rumors and try to really discuss this topic. How do we prepare as states, armed forces, companies, how all the stakeholders are getting prepared for an escalation in the cyberspace. So we'll be discussing this with 4 guests. So we have Raina Stamboliskia. Thank you very much for being here today. We have Vander, CEO of Strategy. We also have Lilian Knibergen. Thank you.
Municipality of The Hague. Thank you so much. Daniel Blanc, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Daniel, d'être avec nous.
We also have Daniel with us. Thank you very much for being here today. You're a former Canadian Armed Forces general for the Cyber Command, so thank you very much. And we also have Ben Hiller,
Senior Policy Officer, Cyber and Hybrid Policy Section of NATO. On débute cette séquence ensemble. Alors, quelle est aujourd'hui?
So we are starting this today. So nowadays, what is the real risk of escalation? This is a question for you all. Tensions have increased, clearly, the last few months, and even worse, these last few weeks. So what is the current situation, actually, and what can we really be fearing for today? Daniel?
In French or in English, you
je vais le dire en anglais, la réponse, mais je peux...
I'll answer in English, but for the Q&A session, you can also ask your question in French, don't worry.
Of course, we have a war in Europe. We have a hybrid war going on in the Indo-Pacific. We have economic uncertainty that's going on based on the situation in the United States. And some of our traditional ground that was secure for over 150 years, that fortress North America, that was so critical to supporting Europe during the First World War and the Second World War, it's being challenged now. There's some concerns about what the situation is going to look like in North America. And this is due to some of that political uncertainty. So there's a lot of risk out there right now today, and I hope we get a chance throughout our conversation here to talk a little bit about what that risk kind of looks like as we unpack that and how we can try to mitigate that, especially in the areas of cyberspace.
Thank you, Daniel. Ben?
Yeah, thank you. So from a NATO perspective, fully agree with what Daniel says. Obviously, from NATO, we look like particularly at one actor or 2 actors, which is Russia and China. And we certainly observe that Russia is amping up its hybrid activities, including in cyberspace, quite considerably. And I think a key concern for us is certainly that we witness a certain degree of recklessness. Hence, the gloves are off, so to say. They are less concerned about unintended consequences and have a higher threshold of risk acceptance. And I think that is a very worrying trend. To give you an example, kind of what we are dealing with at the moment, a statistic. In the last 18 months alone, allies handled over 90, that is 90, politically sensitive cyber campaigns. And when I talk about politically sensitive cyber campaigns, we talk about an impact that concerns the government. So national security personnel gets involved. We're not talking any cyber crime, we're talking about significant incident. That's 90 in the last 18 months across the entire alliance. And more worryingly, over 40 of them hit our critical infrastructure. That is both, of course, relevant for citizens, but also in terms of national security, particularly also for the military, because it's mostly those critical infrastructure that our militaries will use for military mobility, for enablement. If there is a crisis, we rely on those privately owned critical infrastructure, and they are being hit. So the things are not looking good. And our intelligence certainly agrees that things are not going to get better soon. Instead, I think we are dealing with a new normal where this is a norm of behavior of some international actors.
We will discuss later about how to deal with this and to prepare all our cities, armies, states globally, and all citizens. Let's say maybe Lilian, would you like to add your point of view, like cities and for of citizens, like Ben said before?
Yeah, of course. Like the other two speakers, I bring a kind of different perspective, because as a city, as a municipality, we really try to secure our citizens for one of the largest cities in the Netherlands, which is the City of Peace and Justice, The Hague. And at The Hague, we really have a lot of peace-related institutes, which makes our like threat modeling very special. And of course, we really have to work together, because that's the key word on this. Work together within our city, be transparent about the threats that we are seeing, but also really trust each other that when something happens, we really can pick up the phone and just call someone else to get the help that we need or to share information that we have, which is a very important aspect of dealing with threats and the impact that it can have on our city.
Thank you, Liliane. Raina, ce serait intéressant d'avoir votre point de vue, alors en français ou en anglais.
Raina, it would be interesting to hear your point of view. Of course, you can do this in French or English. What about the non-state stakeholders? Because they are also part of the ecosystem, and the impact can be major.
So yeah, there are different things. So we have, the chance to have people with us who come, let's say, from the military, at large. Although NATO is a hybrid, association of military and civilian actors, and we also have cities. The level of how do we deal with threats that concern our residents directly. And in all that landscape, the actors that I'm looking at particularly are non-state actors in the sense of private companies, but also non-profit organizations who do cybersecurity at large, right? So The Hague has a roster of that sort of organizations, be them private or public, non-profit. And what we see there is a dual challenge that is ever more prevalent, which is to protect companies, organizations. At the second level, protect people. And then again, perhaps at some point, look to our military, friends from the military, and discuss whether we can do a dual-use technology of some sort, right? And that's where you do need an integrated and embedded approach and a whole-of-society approach, because, again, a state and the military that goes with has a very different view on protecting what they protect. They protect state interests. sometimes they are not human-centric interests, right? They are not the citizens necessarily and foremost, they're the borders, they are state institutions, and so on and so forth. And that's where private and non-profit organizations come in, because especially for non-profit organizations, their focus is human-centric, meaning we want, states to protect people first and foremost, their fundamental rights, and so on and so forth. So you have a wide array of challenges that are, masked by, let's say, very serious challenges about nation states becoming increasingly violent, which is not a surprise to anyone. I mean, it's in the doctrines of many of those actors, right? And so something that we are seeing, I want to have that said, just to also spark a discussion further down the line, is that what we are seeing is also a sort of an outsourcing of malicious activity by states to non-state actors, especially from the private sector, which is increasingly difficult to track, but increasingly prevalent as well, where, it's a job like any other for them, but for us as defenders, it's increasingly difficult to fathom and to get a grasp of, and to also, have some sort of sanctions and some effect on that sort of actors, right?
Thank you, Heina. So let's talk maybe about solutions and needs to contain that. We understand that the situation is, let's say, some critical point, so we have to work together, you said, Lilian. And what are the solutions and the needs to contain this risk of escalation?
Look, I think we need to understand that this potential economic collapse, which is the worst case scenario, will require nations to abandon the lifeboat politics that we're starting to see right now, where folks are trying to focus inward, trying to kind of maybe even relook at some of the alliances that we have right now. But we need to actually double down on those things. We actually need to, the Western nations need to really focus on the diplomacy aspect of things, the negotiation approach, and we need to, I hate to say the term, bring adults to the table, but have these conversations, because I don't think everyone fully understands the potential impacts, not just from the global collapse on the economies, but economic security is national security, and we've been so successful and prosperous right now in the West, I should say, because of that global trade, because of those alliances, and we need to double down. The one good news I will say, and only speaking from a military perspective, is that our relationship with our military counterparts are very strong. We have gone to the same staff colleges. We've been in the same alliance for a long time, NATO and others. We know each other from the time we were lieutenants all the way up to general. So that foundational relationship is very strong, which is good. And there's other replications of that in other aspects of our societies. But this political aspect of things does have a cascade effect. It is coming down. But we need to reinforce some of those institutions that have good relationships and bring everybody to the table. I think that's the key. And I know it's hard in the current environment, but every effort needs to be made to do that.
Ben.
Yeah, I'm going to echo many of the things that Daniel said. I think as a precondition, we need to accept the fact that cyberspace is contested at all times, right? There is no peace in cyberspace. It's contested all the time. And in such environment, you cannot sit back and wait for something to happen. You need to be a bit more proactive in what you do. And you also need to accept, and this was kind of the mantra for many years when it comes to cyber, that you have to invest in resilience, the ability to bounce back quickly, so you kind of deny adversaries potential benefits. That's not enough. You cannot just invest. Resilience is a big part of it, but it will not change the calculus of adversaries as we see right now, because the risk appetite is increasing, so you need to be a bit more robust. So you need an integrated and proactive approach. What I mean by integrated is that we need to really streamline how we do cyber response at 3 levels, at the political, technical, and military. And all these levels need to be coming together to form a coherent response, and by that I mean throughout peacetime, crisis, and conflict. Supposedly, NATO is in peace at the moment, but in cyberspace, we are not. The problem is, if we are in peacetime, then our defenses are set up for peacetime. So are we adequately postured to react to what's happening in cyberspace? And allies decided last year in Washington, we're not. We need to adopt a new mindset that peacetime in cyberspace is something different than in the kinetic world. So what we need to do at the political level, we need to formulate campaign-style responses to cyber campaigns we are seeing. These are multiple activities that are hitting us that in accumulation, the impact is actually quite significant. But so far, we tended to see them in isolation. Kind of, we react to individual events. We need to see them as campaigns, and we need to formulate campaign styles, responses, also calculating in, of course, risk of escalation. At a technical level, it's clear that we need to raise our bar in terms of resilience. Not because we think that we're going to get better in terms of defending ourselves, but because we know it's going to get worse. So we need to kind of set a higher bar and kind of also agree what good looks like when it comes to resilience across the board, across nations. And at the military level, and this is kind of coming back to what I said before, we need to do a better job of getting our military a clearer role what they do during peacetime. Right? Suppose at peacetime when cyberspace is contested. And here I don't mean that they need to have a fighting mandate during peacetime, but what we have to avoid at all costs is that if things escalate in cyberspace and kind of goes into the kinetic world, that the military has not been in the room in the build-up because supposedly it was peacetime and the civilians were kind of dealing with it. So how do you make sure that military is involved, engaged from all the time, 24/7, that when things escalate, there's a smooth transition to what the military needs to do? So you need to integrate all these components together.
Thank you, Ben. We are going to discuss maybe more about these exercises and how to prepare in the peacetime to anticipate and prepare for the wartime. We're going to discuss about, but maybe Lilian would like to add some things about these means and solutions.
Yeah, I think it's very clear that organizations like mine as a city, but also organizations within the city and within our country needs to really have a clear view on the threats that are there and make that practical, because the military aspect is very for me high level and a bit abstract, because I need, my job as a deputy CISO is to secure my organization. So what that means for me is to really look at the threats and the threat level, and then look at what countermeasures we need to take and the things that we need to do to secure our data and our applications, for example. And well, there are a lot of scenarios you can think of and scenarios you can try to stay ahead of, and you have to exercise them, of course. But it's important to see that there are, like, sometimes the goal is a cyber attack and it has physical effects, and the other way around is also possible, that a cyber attack is merely the means to create the physical impact. So that those two things are for us as a city are important to take into account when we try to, when we decide on countermeasures, for example. So that's a very important part, I think.
Raina, and the same questions for the non-state actors, how they are adapting for this situation.
Yeah, it's a complex question because, I mean, I will just, jump with 2 feet into the unpleasantness right now. I mean, how many private sector actors are you seeing engaging in advocacy and public policy? I mean, they're like, yeah, I can count them on fingers of one hand, right? So we have a very serious and nefarious disconnect between whatever's happening at the governance level, which is government or the EU in our case, or international cooperation more broadly, and the people who provide the tools, for example, right? And who are also very significant actors of the value chain, right? Because when you are a company, a cybersecurity company vendor making 10 million a year, you do have an impact, right? So, and you know, and a lot of questions arise there because, I mean, we're talking about an integrated approach. How many rules or incentives even do we have, for example, for interoperable technologies, right? Because we are talking about interoperability of European armies and others, you know, in terms of equipment, in terms of joint exercises and so on and so forth. But if you go to any company and you see that even in 2025, you have companies that in the same one, they have 7 XDRs in the same company. You're like, why? You know, and then you try to project this into having a coordinated action between municipalities, between executive level, you know, a government and many governments. This is crazy, right? And it's just and we need that sort of consciousness, you know, that sort of self-consciousness of you as a private actor. You are part of that prosperity that we are defending. Right, but since you are a valuable actor, you also need to be involved in policy making because those are the rules of the game that we live by, right? So the EU is making strides on that sort of aspect. For example, with the Cyber Solidarity Act, which will require us to think about those things, right? Because it's like a digital shield, the way they present it, meaning public-private partnerships to do SOCs, security operation centers, in different places in the EU, so that basically we have not just a detection and identification of threats, but also a shared situational awareness at the European level, and including different actors from the value chain. And when we talk about policy making and policy cooperation at large, especially international cooperation, I mean, it's what you must understand is that we have also approaches that are state-based. And for example, we have the open-ended working group at the UN, and it's been there since 2019, and it's incredibly difficult to have non-state actors, meaning private sector or non-profits, join those discussions, yet those are the international cyber norms that we're discussing there. And how can we continue to maintain peace when everyone is just, arming up? So of course, some of us are doing, working also to foster that participation. But if nobody wants to participate, then we have a different problem, right? And if we don't come together with the shared understanding that it's up to us to protect ourselves, and there are no other adults that will come and save us, then we're doomed. Yeah, I'm sorry to kind of be the party pooper here.
I think maybe would you like to react or to Daniel, Ben?
Yeah, I think from a government perspective or international security, also from a NATO perspective, I think the importance of public-private partnerships is recognized, and I think Ukraine was, I think, the last case in point, or the biggest case in point, where we saw that we can't do effective cyber defense or cyber security also at the international level without the private sector and their capabilities, their situational awareness, and the considerable amount of funding that is available. However, of course, for states, that still sits uneasy. I mean, I'm going to be very frank. National security has traditionally been a state responsibility. It is still for most of the other domains, warfighting domains, I mean land, air, sea, space to some degree less, but certainly in cyber it is not the case, and you rely hugely on industry, both for situational awareness, for security, for a range of things, and that you have to marry up then with national security considerations. Now, NATO is a particular case on top of it because we are primarily a military organization, and I would say that military, more than the civil cyber defenders on the state side, are even more in a pickle, so to say, when it comes to working with industry, because they're very state-driven, hierarchical, very clear operational planning, which sometimes does not sit so easily working with industry, but you have to. And that has been recognized. And certainly at NATO, I think Ukraine was a huge wake-up call, so much so that allies actually decided to set up a NATO Integrated Cyber Defense Center last year, which will bring together our militaries, our civil cyber defenders, and industry 24/7 for the sole purpose of monitoring alliance cyberspace in peacetime, not during crisis conflict, but already now, because what we realize is that the very infrastructure that we will rely on, critical infrastructure for our military mobility, we need to be aware now what the status is in terms of cyber hygiene. Can we rely on them if things escalate? And for that, we need situational awareness from those infrastructure providers, but also industry at large. And that today, at day zero, and not when things escalate. So the recognition is there. Things have been set in motion, including military, but also to bring them together with the civil cyber defenders and industry 24/7. Unfortunately, we will have to do probably a good job to entice the industry to come to us, because allies decided to set this up in Mons, in shape. It's not very exciting there. It's very military, so it's going to be probably more of a job to get people to co-locate with us. So we need to find good incentives, but the desire is there, for sure.
Thank you, Ben. Maybe one word, of course, about escalation thresholds that should be clarified, and on what criteria, on which one criteria, Daniel?
Let me just back up a little bit, because I just want to reinforce something that Ben said, if that's okay. Look, land, air, sea, and space, pretty well understood. Cyberspace is a human-made domain, and it changes every day. And the speed of that change is always outstripping the political, legislative, and policy processes that our nations have. So it makes it very challenging. And I know professional policy officers are always challenged with this. It makes it a little bit different. And I agree with Lillian about the comment is, how do we, what we see at the strategic level, because we're actually in the cyber fight, as Ben mentioned, today, right now. We don't call it war, but we call it the fight, because we are constantly being hit every single day by those nation-state actors, their proxies, and cyber criminals, some of them obfuscating their activity to make it look like it's each other doing things, but we're getting hit every day. And how do we take that information and make sure that it is a whole of society, whole of nation response, and that that information cascades down to the cities, to the municipalities, to the provinces or states or whatever systems that you have in place? It's a challenge. It's a challenge because some of the fight that we're in, because it's below the law of armed conflict, threshold of conflict level, and sometimes we've collected that information through very discrete intelligence capabilities. It's not always easy to kind of download that information to all the way down to a municipality, as an example. But we need to do that. And we need to, to reinforce the other comment about private industry, like they're a critical component of this fight. And yet, we're still struggling to figure out, for example, how to give top secret security clearances or enhanced security clearances to private industry. But we envision a world where in a operations center at the national level, at the military level, at the police level, that you have private industry actually sitting there, because they're seeing the same things that we're seeing, sometimes through a different lens, but they're seeing some of the same threat actors and some of the things. So if we're going to push back against the Chinas and the Russias for example, that are actually conducting a lot of these activities, and they're using a whole of society approach. We need to do the same thing from a defense perspective, and it's tough, and it costs a lot of money, both in human and in capital, to be able to do that.
Yeah, if I can react to that, this underlines really the ability that we need a strong ecosystem, that we really need to trust our vendors, that we need to work together with a strong national cybersecurity center, but also those national cybersecurity centers throughout Europe and with other partners in the world working together to get that information out there, to share that, and to help each other, because maturity is very different between a lot of organizations. Within a lot of municipalities, for example, we have kind of we have a larger department for security, for example, than a really small municipality would have. So there are very different approaches to cybersecurity and different approaches to how we can defend ourselves. But the question should be, how could we defend each other and help each other lift that bar and raise that bar?
So I repeat my question, because you didn't want to answer, Daniel. So again, the escalation thresholds that we have to discuss about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, and which responsibility, who is responsible to define to this point, that we cannot avoid it.
So the escalation thresholds, to be honest with you, changes with every single election that our countries have. And I say that because the political parties that get elected will decide what their level of risk tolerance is and risk acceptance is when it comes to some of these things. We can put policies in place, but politicians can change those policies through their legislative frameworks and processes. And what was acceptable 6 months ago might not be acceptable today. So it's a bit of a challenge. The other issue is that technology and the changes in technology also forces the changes in our approach, because we didn't always, for example, anticipate the impact that artificial intelligence would have on cyber defenders. Because the adversaries and the offensive teams are using AI at speed. We're always in the react mode to this, and it's causing us to now look at what our thresholds are, and what they were yesterday might not be what they're going to be tomorrow. And I mentioned it a little bit, but the legislative process is just so slow. And that's not a criticism, it's just a reality of it. How do we adapt, and how do we put legislation forward that is built, because of course politicians want to have a very rigid box around those legislative processes. How do we make them flexible enough and make the box big enough so that it can adapt to the future technologies that roll out? It's a challenge. And I know that professional policy officers like Ben are faced with this issue every single day when we come up. So each nation has to determine what those thresholds are. We can have the conversations as alliance members or coalitions of the willing, but it's tough. It's tough. And what might be acceptable, for example, here in Europe might be different in North America, might be different in the Indo-Pacific region. And it's also based on the activities of the actors and the breadth and depth of their nefarious activities. So it's tough. I'll kick it over to Ben, because I think you'll have some policy insights for us.
Well, I think, piggybacking on that, I think what Danny described already is the difficulty to do that at the national level, right? And then also, of course, you need to look at different levels. I mean, there's a different debate at the political level than you would have at the military level, or that you would have at the technical level. Arguably, at the technical level, it's the easiest. Defining thresholds is important because it informs the severity schema and kind of how you react, mitigate risks, and how you manage risks. So in a way, thresholds are useful in terms of how you react at the technical level. At the political level, it's not as clear-cut, right? It's exactly how Danny said. It's a mostly a political decision. How much risk do you accept, and how much malicious cyber behavior from an adversary do you accept during peacetime? And that will always be guided by the current geopolitical context, chiefly now, the war in Ukraine. Now, put that at 32 alliance members, and you have a whole different debate. You have 32 different opinions and appetites for risks between them. So thresholds, that's a whole other debate. But there's also a very clear answer to that from the alliance, actually. When you talk about the famous red lines, where are the red lines, at what point do we erect? And some see it as a cop-out, some see it as strategic ambiguity, but the answer is we're not going to set threshold because of exactly those reasons I just said. You will never able to have one framework that fits for all times, for all situations, for all members of the alliance. And there's another factor in this. Our belief is, most NATO policy officer, the policy wonks, that if you set those red lines or thresholds, then you can be sure that adversaries will hit just below it and test you constantly. And then what do you do? So in a way, strategic ambiguity is also extremely useful because it allows you room for maneuver and to adapt in what the situation is. And that is why allies have decided that they will not set those thresholds. Having said that, and coming back to the exercises, they're exercising those every half year at the political, military, and technical level to exactly not be in a situation that if we need to make decisions fast based on what is happening, that we're not caught out. So we are having a variety of scenarios that test us, that are modeled very much on real-world examples, seeing where we go, testing our procedures, that if we decide politically that now's the time to react forcefully and very visibly, that those procedures are very clear, right? But in terms of thresholds politically, it might be desirable for some areas, but certainly at a 32, it might not be actually that useful.
Thank you, Ben. Lilian, would you like to add something, Heina?
Yeah, I think from a city perspective, those thresholds are very interesting and informative for us, but we need to comply with our national rules, of course, and see those thresholds to really make them pragmatic and concrete for our own organization and our own city, and have that conversation within our critical infrastructure within the city to see where how we adapt to those, well, red lines or to those thresholds. So that's, but indeed, it's a very difficult question, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I understand. I mean, I know that it's super difficult, and I mean, if you asked us whether we could meet, when we can meet for lunch, it will take forever to decide, right? So imagine what the situation is when you have, I don't know, 4 or 30 states trying to decide what to do. What concerns me here is that while we, the policy wonks, the people with the operational experience and so on and so forth, are struggling to come up to terms with common, let's say, ways to describe a shared reality, right? Because that's what thresholds are in a way. Those decisions are being taken by, well, unusual suspects, like when you have a court, saying that, for example, you are not getting help by your cyber insurance because you were hit with a ransomware that is supposedly coming from a hostile state actor. So this is a situation that amounts to a war action. Those are the sorts of weird things that happen and that become the rule because we don't have others. So to me, cyber norms, it's tough. And I'm not saying this because I like it. I say it because I empathize with Ben. We have a shared past of sorts, and it's terrible. It's very difficult to get people on the table and to talk about that sort of things. But we need also to move forward in a way that is, we are creating, again, criteria for a shared reality that can provoke a conventional response, for example, Article 5 of the NATO treaty, right, which is scary. And we are not talking about having a piece of paper that it's written, if Russia does this, then shoot a missile on them and let your brain sit in a jar somewhere and wait for this to happen. What we're looking at is how do we discuss about those things, who talks about those things, and in what configurations. And that's another thing that concerns me is the proliferation of gray zones in state actions, and also the proliferations of fora where those things are discussed. All right, if it's too difficult with 32, then leave what it is at the UN level, but then you have bilaterals, then you have regionals, then you have, you name it. And then at some point, we're fragmenting again and further that sort of conversation and the possibility to ever reach a shared reality of sorts, right? And of course, it needs to mutate. It needs to evolve with the time and with the needs. But the question is, if we never get together to talk about it, we'll never have the chance of having anything that kind of also unites us together in times of need, right?
Ben?
Understanding the frustration fully, and it's a shared frustration. So I think from an, again, NATO alliance perspective, I think there is clarity what the thresholds are without defining them, and that is mostly done through exercises, and also because there's a clear commitment by all 32 allies that international law applies in entirety. In cyberspace as it does in the real world. So there's no contest as is in the UN in terms of how much international law applies or not with the usual suspects. So in a way, at least those 32 agree very much, and they also agree that if certain cyber attacks are happening and there is an effect to a certain degree, then that there will potentially be a response. The response might not be visible. It might be coordinated, so some allies do this, some allies do that. So it's not that everyone has to react at the same time. That's also in recognition that states have different own thresholds in terms of what they're accepting to do or in terms of response. Some are focusing on diplomatic measures, others on technical measures, others focus on more military and proactive measures. So, but there is a clear understanding in terms of how that concert could work. I think from our perspective, what is more useful to talk about is not this famous red lines, right? It's more red bands. It's kind of like scenarios in terms of where they are in escalation that fit in one or two of bands in terms of escalation, and then based on that to put into place sort of response plans that are below Article 5 and that really look at the entire spectrum pol-mil tech and what can be done, and that could then be triggered. So there is a more coherent response rather than, okay, oh, something happened and what do we do? So there are, red bands and there are kind of clear ideas what can be then done in these bands, so to say. So it's very important to have those discussions without kind of absolutely defining that's exactly where the red line is, but kind of an understanding what the scale is. And I think that that's already really helpful. Article 5 has been mentioned, and that comes up in often. I think there's also been actually quite an evolution in thinking when it comes to Article 5. In 2014, when the decision was taken by allies that a cyber attack can trigger Article 5, which is our collective response to an armed attack, we kind of still thought about cyber as like there's going to be this one cyber attack and things are going to blow up and there's going to be equivalent to a kinetic missile maybe, right? We know now that's not how cyber is used. Right? It's not used as the first attack. It's used constantly. It's contested all the time. There are malicious cyber campaigns that, when it comes to the individual incidents, are well below the Article 5 threshold. So either we were very good in deterring those Article 5 incidents that we thought of, or our adversaries have learned very quickly, like, oh, let's just lower the threshold with multiple events, and then maybe we're not going to trigger anything. Now, allies realized that too, and in 2021 they actually clarified, it's like, no, like we also, the cumulative impact of combined cyber activities can equally trigger Article 5. So kind of to make clear that we understand very well what is happening is mostly in that gray space. And if needed, we will decide that that is Article 5 too. But in a way, we're also moving away a little bit from this Article 5 debate because it has been led quite deeply and emotionally, and sometimes it's more important to actually doing things and to actually prepare, exercise, and to see how we bring the communities together, political, military, technical, to actually be a bit more proactive rather than do good policy debates or legal debates, but actually pose those strategic dilemmas for our adversaries in cyberspace as well.
Thank you, Ben. Daniel, one word about these exercises that we were talking about with Ben just before international one, this international cooperation that it's so important to maintain and to improve. And also the discussion between the international cyber commander that are also a key point.
So let me talk a little bit about exercises because we might have a little bit of a different view. Look, exercises are important. It allows us to develop our lessons learned, our best practices, understand our response mechanisms, and really kind of build that foundational trust that is so important when nations are working together. And it also allows us to identify where some of the challenges are when it comes to our technology, our infrastructure, our investment in people, but at the same time, let me tell you that we don't learn as much from exercises as we'd like. And where we have had success is from actual conducting operations. Because exercises are important, don't get me wrong, especially in an alliance construct or coalitions of the willing, but where we've really learned is in the actual conduct of operations, both on the offensive and the defensive side of things. Because when you're doing it for real is when the real lessons come out. Because then you're having the real conversations with your legal teams, with your policy teams, and you're briefing these things up at the highest levels. And that has really driven the development of our cyber capability. And it's also allowed us to transition to the conversation about cyber commanders. The cyber commanders, I'll call it the global cyber commanders, but really the Western cyber commanders, get together twice a year in different areas where they can share those best practices and those observations. And it's not, again, just from exercises, it's also through the lens of operations. And the advantage here is it's beyond just NATO, so you get some perspectives of nations, for example, from the Indo-Pacific, from the Middle East, from Latin America and the Caribbean, who bring sometimes very different views and approaches that are important to absorb. So 2 things, exercises, yes, important, need to do them, learn more though from operations, and number 2, the form that we have for the cyber commanders to get together, which is replicated, by the way, in almost all the domains, let's not kid ourselves, is an important aspect of being able to be interoperable, but most importantly, establishing that trust that I talked about, because when things get really ugly and we need to work together, you don't want to exchange business cards at that time. You want to be able to know each other and have those relationships, and that's key. So I just kind of put a little bit of a spin on the exercise aspect. Important, but not as great a tool as actual doing operations together.
Thank you, Daniel. Lilian, maybe a word about this kind of things to share that you were saying before, that you have to work together. This is the key point, and this is the line of this roundtable for sure. How are you working, making maybe some exercises? Do you have some key meetings to know better, maybe industries, private companies around you, to share with other municipalities what to do and to be prepared if cyber war is coming?
Well, not exactly to the last point you said, if cyber war is coming, but there's a strong collaboration and a strong working together ethic on in the Netherlands, but also within Europe. And we partner with similar cities around Europe, for example, with Barcelona. We partner with a lot of organizations within the Netherlands who have a similar approach as we do to cybersecurity. There's also, like Dan mentioned, you don't want to exchange business cards when you need them, but when, well, in peacetime or when you want to exercise. So really knowing each other and talking to each other beforehand, that's important. And there are a lot of ways to collaborate and to communicate with each other before that. And specifically at The Hague, we do that within like the metropole region, within the Hague Security Delta, which is a collaboration between businesses and our city. And of course, regional with the peace institutes, for example, within the city, which is called ISACs. And our ISAC is a collaboration where we share information, help each other, and really have contact like every week or so to really get to know each other and to know when is this relevant to you or is it relevant to you. So we really need to get to know each other as well, which is important, I think.
Thank you very much. We still have some minutes. Do you have questions? Would you like to ask a question to our speakers? Yes, I'm coming.
Thank you for this talk. It was really interesting to listen. I would like to ask to Mr. Hiller that NATO is, as we know, the defensive alliance, but yet, as you mentioned, the cyberspace is contested at all times, and for instance, Russia's GRU is active at all times to break this peace. So in this context, what is NATO's stance on following a more proactive policy to mitigate this risk before they even happen, instead of a defensive one? I would like to ask this question.
We just have a little bit of a hard time hearing the full. Can you just repeat that a little bit?
So the final question is, what does NATO think about following a proactive stance against cyber threats instead of a defensive approach, since NATO is a defensive alliance?
Sorry, it's just that all the speakers face that direction. So like, you hear us, we don't hear ourselves very well. As I said, I mean, there has been a major shift in thinking in the alliance. When we talked about Article 5, 2014, we very much focused on defensive, and NATO remains a defensive alliance, right? But the policy certainly for cyber has changed quite significantly, and in 2021, allies recognized that we need a more proactive approach in cyberspace. Now, a more proactive approach in cyberspace during peacetime. So that doesn't mean that NATO suddenly is going on the offensive, but it's still a defensive alliance. But in terms of how we organize our defenses, we are probably a bit more proactive. What does that mean? Operationally, we're focusing more on defensive cyberspace operations proactively, smoking out potential threats, embedded vulnerabilities in our systems. So rather than kind of waiting for something to happen, then react. So we're actively looking, right? We're focusing on rapid assistance to each other. So NATO has stood up a virtual cyber incident support capability where allies help allies after an event happened and an ally needs help, but also potentially before. So kind of joint threat hunting, if you want, expedition. It also means on the political level that you pose strategic dilemmas at all times. So you answer in a campaign way to cyber campaigns that we are witnessing. And those responses are not always visible for the public, but it's a coordinated approach between nations saying, okay, we're going to react like this, and this is how we're going to pose strategic dilemmas politically for this actor. Now, all that, of course, is based on situation awareness. If you don't see what's happening across the alliance, then these kind of proactive responses are very hard to muster. And this is why a key pillar of that approach is what we mentioned before, the engagement with the private sector, also at the military level, and kind of building that center that I mentioned before, where all this information comes together in one place. And that where each of the cyber defense communities can then take that information and plan better ahead in terms of a response. So more proactive, absolutely. It doesn't mean we're going on an offensive. It doesn't mean we are kind of creating our defenses more proactively.
Yeah, let me just illuminate an aspect of this. Nations are conducting offensive cyber operations. They're just not doing it under the NATO construct. They're doing it as sovereign operations. That's an important distinction. And it's not, it's the reasons why Ben mentioned, it's that we haven't met that threshold. But nations have given themselves the authorities and are conducting offensive cyber operations as required under very tight governance and oversight and compliance and all those other things that need to be done from a national perspective. But these are national sovereign operations. So just wanted to make sure that people understand that it might not be done under one alliance construct, but nations reserve the right to do it under their national authorities.
Yeah, hello, good morning. Thank you very much for all the precious insights. I'm from European Commission funded project called CoCyber, and our aim is to create a platform, to create a community between the civil and defense sector in cybersecurity to, as you said before, streamline processes, create more partnerships, and also foster dual-use technology development. And so we're obviously doing surveys, focus groups, but what better opportunity to ask you, what would you do if you were asked to create connections, create better connections? What do you think would be a way to put together in the same room, in the same platform, civilians and people from the defense sector? As you said, also, there is the problem with security clearance, and there is a problem with sharing of information that is not always allowed. And yeah, how do you think, if you had a blank page, what would you do?
Yeah, I'll just speak through my lens. Look, it takes some political will. It takes strong institutions in the cybersecurity space to have those mature conversations between public and private and industry. And by the way, we should add academics in there, and there's others, of course, even in the NGO community. It just takes work. It takes work for and leadership to get out there and make those connections. There is no one, we have not found a magic bullet or a magic solution, but conferences like this, engagements, bilateral, multilateral, and certain key institutions. For example, for us, it's our Center for Cybersecurity, who has relationships and partnerships divisions that tries to bring everybody together, the telcos, the internet service providers, the technology companies, etc. So it's about bringing everyone together. There needs to be some will, there needs to be some leadership there. Each nation is going to take a different construct to this. But it's work. Let's not sugarcoat it. It's a lot of work. And you're not always going to get it right. But we can work through these things. And I will say this, just having observed the US construct, they're very good at it. They're very good at bringing private industry and public together, whether it's for their cyber program, their space program, their military industrial complex. It's a mature process in the US. We're still working on it. And I'm sure the EU has a process, NATO has a process. It's just a lot of work.
Yeah, echoing exactly that. Interesting fact or fun fact, when we started to talk about civil-military cooperation in the NATO framework, and we talked to SACEUR, Supreme Allied Command in Europe, and Allied Command Operations in SHAPE, we needed to also start to learn speaking the same language, actually. Because what we mean by civil and what the military means as civil is two different things. We use civil and civilian interchangeably in the civil world, whereas our military colleagues, so when we started to talk about civil-military cooperation, they thought like, yeah, we've got civilians working here too. Obviously, that's not at all what we meant. We meant the industry, we meant academia, we meant the civil, the civil industry in terms of also the cybersecurity agencies. So speaking the same language is kind of the first barrier you kind of have to overcome when it comes to civil military. Also because our military colleagues, for obvious reasons, have every word defined out. It's very clear everything what it means, and we policy people are very flexible because we try to negotiate compromise, right? So in terms of language, is a big sometimes barrier. And the second thing I think we learned is that we need to have a very clear focus what these partnerships should achieve. So it's no good like, oh, in general we need to enhance civil-military relationships because, we're all in the same boat. That's not going to work. So when we are setting up this integrated center in SHAPE, it's got a very clear mission. And in our case, it is a bit more of a military-focused mission, kind of the link to the civilian world of infrastructure, of situational awareness that helps NATO's core missions, essentially. So there is kind of a military taint, but with the recognition that obviously we rely probably 70% on other stakeholders to do military cyber correctly. So kind of a clear mandate and very defined framework what you try to achieve in order to ultimately avoid magic handovers, as I mentioned before, right? We are now in peacetime. Is our civilian authorities dealing with cyber war, essentially, or cyber conflict or cyber contest, with the military kind of spectating and having situational awareness. But we need to make sure that the transitions go smoothly very quickly when things escalate. And that's why we need to have, as I say, interoperability from day zero and not from day one.
Thank you so much. It's already the end of this session. It was a pleasure to have you today with us. Thank you so much. Thank you too to be with us today.